My presentation is on Rudyard Kipling and his short story, The Man Who Would Be King, pages 923 through 947. So, Rudyard Kipling is the author of many titles, but the one that we are all probably most familiar with is The Jungle Book, which was published in 1894. His life was an extremely varied tale. He was born in British India in 1865. He described his early childhood as being like paradise. However, at the age of 6, as was customary for British families that were residing in India, Rudyard and his sister were sent to live in a boarding home for children. This was a miserable time for both children, subject to mistreatment and abuse. And at the age of 12, he was sent to a private school, the United Services College, where he flourished and began writing. In 1882, he returned to India and started working as a journalist. By the time he returned to England in 1889, he was already famous for his literary talent. In 1892, Rudyard married an American woman, and the two made the trek across the Atlantic to settle in Vermont. A few years passed, and due to what's rumored to be a violent altercation with Carolyn's brother, the two returned to England. In 1907, Rudyard became the first English author to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. He continued writing until he died in 1936. So, The Man Who Would Be King was published in 1888, and it's set during the British Raj when the British Crown ruled over India from 1858 to 1947. The imperialists of the time believed in their racial superiority as well as the need to civilize the colonized people, who they believed to be primitive and incapable of self governance. This belief system is reflected in our two main characters and their sense of entitlement to rule over others. The story takes place on the edge of colonial British India and in the region of Kafiristan, which is located in northern Afghanistan. That part of the Middle East was often considered to be dangerous and unconquerable by the imperialist rulers. Kipling's opinion of imperialism was a confusing mix of beliefs that often seemed contradictory. As a product of the British Empire, he would celebrate empire as a civilizing force. Rudyard was also the author of The White Man's Burden, published in 1899, which tasks white people with civilizing and governing non European peoples. Obviously, this is a racist and problematic take. But yet, Kipling was also a critic of imperial hubris, as evidenced in The Man Who Would Be King, when he highlights the moral corruption and dangers of empire. His two main characters are portrayed as foolish men who believe they can use their assumed power as British men to outwit and take control over the people of Kafiristan. He openly acknowledges the moral ambiguity and even the destructiveness of imperialism, yet he still seems to have sympathy for the British characters. Rather than speaking against all imperialism, it seems that Rudyard is creating a warning against being overreaching in the rush for power. Kipling appears to accept and even endorse the British occupation of India as justified or beneficial, but draws the line at extending that dominance recklessly into other regions. In this way, he suggests that empire has its place, but must be pursued with restraint, awareness, and respect for its limits. So, The Man Who Would Be King is a blend of adventure, satire, and political commentary. A nameless journalist narrates the story, likely a stand in for Kipling himself. The narrator meets two eccentric former soldiers, British drifters, Daniel Devoe and Peachy Carnahan. Devoe is ambitious, charismatic, and prone to delusions of grandeur, while Carnahan is more pragmatic, practical, and loyal. The narrator serves as a foil to Carnahan and Devoe as he represents the so-called respectable world and acts as a mere observer of their story. Devoe and Carnahan devise a plan. They will travel to Kafiristan, exploit the warfaring tribal divisions by use of manipulation, British identity, Masonic symbols, and military knowledge. And crazy enough, their plan works. The Kafiris believe that Devoe and Carnahan are not just kings, they're gods. They are worshipped, given power over the tribes, and they are treated as divine rulers. The illusion unravels, though, when Devoe insists on taking a local woman as his wife. His bride-to-be is not so willing, and she bites Devoe during the wedding ceremony. Devoe, lo and behold, bleeds like a mere mortal, and the Kafiris now turn to rage and violence at the discovery of this betrayal. Devoe is murdered. while Carnahan is tortured into madness. The Kafiris let Carnahan go, and they send him with Draveau's severed head, bearing a heavy gold crown fit for a king. Carnahan returns to the narrator's office where he tells his tale with the head bearing the burden of proof and the devastating cost of their failed imperial fantasy. The next day, the narrator goes to find Carnahan, only to find that Carnahan and the head have disappeared forever. Here is a list of themes with their corresponding takeaways. The illusions and delusions of imperialism. Empire promises power and glory, but ends in tragedy when based on illusions and delusions of superiority. Hubris and overreach. Pride and overconfidence, especially in the context of power, lead to downfall. Identity and masquerade. The masks people wear can be powerful, but are always fragile. The bigger they come, the harder they fall, to use a cliche. Civilization versus savagery and the myth of superiority. The line between civility and savagery is not where the supposed superiors think it is. Consequences of power. Having power has its toll, not just on the colonized, but those in power as well, as evidenced by Draveau's death and Carnahan's descent into insanity. The first passage we will analyze states, quote, "Therefore, such as it is, we will let it alone and go away to some other place where a man isn't crowded and can come to his own. We are not little men, and there is nothing that we are afraid of except drink, and we have signed a contract on that. Therefore, we are going away to be kings." Unquote. This passage takes place at the beginning of the story, with Draveau and Carnahan confidently declaring their plan to become kings to the narrator, after explaining how the British government over India allows men no freedom. So they have drafted a contract declaring sobriety, loyalty, and no involvement with women. With self-discipline and confidence that knows no bounds, they will become kings. The man who would be king functioned as a mirror of Imperial Britain's reality. Per Kennedy, the British Empire was in a mad scramble for expansion of existing and procurement of new colonies, fueled by a never-ending, unsatiated greed and power lust. This historical context sets the tone of Kipling's commentary and his use of the themes found in the passage, such as the delusions and illusions of imperialism, as well as hubris and overreach, and identity and masquerade. In a show of dramatic irony, the characters see themselves as heroic empire builders, while the audience knows that their plan is delusional and even laughable, if not downright dangerous. Their contract against drinking adds to the absurdity. Just a small dose of moral restraint will, of course, just naturally lead to their king-making. The dramatic irony in this passage enhances our understanding of imperial hubris. Their arrogance and belief in their own superiority is what sets up their eventual downfall. The men believe themselves to be above others. Quote, "We are not little men," unquote. But their belief in superiority is what in fact blinds them. This passage also pokes fun at the imperial mindset. British men can just parachute into a foreign land and become rulers by virtue of their nationality and supposed self-control. But their goal is to rule a realm was not truly an absurd concept when we look at what was actually happening around the world at that time. Not only were individual countries seeking new land to colonize, but with the return of charter companies, Imperial Britain saw a large host of wealthy men, quote, "willing to wager their fortunes on the rights to rule their own realm," unquote. This passage is the foundation of the story arc. It sets up the contrast between their naive and arrogant confidence and the grim outcome of their journey. It acts as a foreshadowing of their downfall, and it sets up Kipling's critique of imperial hubris. Draveau and Carnahan believe they have set themselves upon a noble mission of civilization, yet the reader knows that their assumptions are unstable and dangerous, as well as the fact that these supposed savages would do much better without the two men's interventions. The next passage we will analyze states, quote, "What's to be afraid of, lass? Come and kiss me." He puts his arm round her. She shuts her eyes, gives a bit of a squeak, and down goes her face in the side of Dan's flaming red beard. "The slut's bitten me," says he, clapping his hand to his neck, and sure enough, his hand was red with blood. Billy Fish and two of his matchlock men catches hold of Dan by the shoulders and drags him in the Bashkai lot, while the priests howl in their lingo, "Neither God nor devil, but a man." Unquote. This scene is during Draveau's wedding ceremony when the would-be bride is presented to the god-king ruler. The Kafiri are suspicious of Draveau's wish to marry, as gods don't marry mortals, and terrified, the bride bites him. When he bleeds, the illusion of his godliness is shattered. The crowd rises up in rage, the anger of betrayal fuels them, and in Draveau's sustained efforts to prove he is a god, Draveau has now instead proven that he is immortal. Everything leading up to this point has been grandiose, filled with deception and manipulation. The bride's act of resistance is an example of symbolic irony. The bite is a small, simple act, yet it brings down a whole empire. Draveau believes that the marriage will cement his godliness and control over the Kafiri, but instead it destroys it. The woman's instinctive action becomes a symbol of truth, cutting through illusion. And here we see the fragility of power, even when the power seems large, overbearing, and invincible. Draveau, as a king god, wore a powerful mask. Yet all it took was one small action to break the illusion and bring him to his tragic end. Kennedy also comments on the indigenous response to imperial conquest. Indigenous resistance was widespread, generating the now all but forgotten little wars that erupted along the continually shifting imperial frontier. Dozens of such wars broke out towards the end of the century. Unquote. This passage is the climax of the story, and it's a clear exposure of its major themes. It shows the dangers of overreaching power, the collapse of imperial hubris and fantasy, and it foreshadows the consequences of power taken through illusion and manipulation. This is also where the story shifts from being a tale of satire to a tragedy, where Kipling forces the reader to confront the cost of arrogance. Kipling's The Man Who Would Be King and Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde both explore the complexities of human nature and the consequences of overreaching ambition. Exploring duality via transformation and the correlating downfall, seen by Dr. Jekyll's transformation into Mr. Hyde and the unleashing of suppressed desires that led to his demise, and Draveau's transformation into a god king and his attempt to marry a mortal woman, leading to his own death and to the collapse of his fabricated empire. Both stories also play with moral consequences, which can also be seen here as mortal consequences, as both pieces end in tragedy and death due to the actions of Jekyll and Draveau, which emphasizes the dangers of overstepping moral and ethical boundaries, as well as overreaching ambition and hubris. And here are my references. Thank you so much and have a great day.